Let's start by giving our praises to the Most High, whose true name in Hebrew is Yahweh, and the name of his only begotten Son, whose true name in Hebrew is Yahweh Shai, and the Holy Spirit, which in Hebrew is the Rakakwadash. Double honors to the elders and apostles by the Holy Spirit who taught us his truth. Honors to the brothers, making their bodies a living sacrifice to push the gospel. Peace and blessings to the hopeful elect, which will be the so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, and Seminole Indians who make up the 12 tribes of Israel, according to scripture and according to prophecy. The hopeful elect being 1/3 of these people that are going to return back to the Most High and receive salvation, while the remaining of our people be destroyed in judgment. So be back with another lesson through the mercy of Yahweh Bahashim Yahweh Shah. So it looked like these videos that I do on the Northern Kingdom is going to be a series. And the title of this lesson is going to be Curses of the Indigenous Americans. This is going to be number 2. Last week, I did video number 1 talking about the different diseases, plagues, and pestilence that were brought on the Native Americans, the Native Mexicans, and so on. Well, this one, we're going to be talking about the famine, more specifically, the buffalo extermination, which contributed to the extermination and genocide of the so-called Native Americans. And I've been waiting for a long time to do a real in-depth video concerning the Northern Kingdom and their history and how they fit the curses of Deuteronomy, but I could just really never come around to do it because I'd be so busy. So we're just going to do a series. Lord willing, get something each week or every other week. So again, the title of the lesson, Curses of the Indigenous Americans. This will be number 2. And we're going to talk about the buffalo extermination. And when we say Indigenous Americans, that's not just talking about the Native Americans, not just talking about the indigenous people of North America, but the indigenous people of North, South, and Central America. So when we speaking about, for example, the North American Indians, the so-called Native Americans, well, the same thing applies to the Cubans, to the Puerto Ricans, to the Dominicans, to the Mexicans, to the Brazilians. Yeah, because these people are classified as different people today, but they really the same people because they have a common ancestor. They go all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they're the children of Israel. Same people, different tribes. So whatever we say for one really goes for all of the tribes. And when these people came to the Americas way back, they came over here together. So again, the curses of the Indigenous Americans. Number 2, this will be the buffalo extermination. So, got a couple videos we're going to look into. We're going to check this one out first, probably let it play twice, listen carefully. And the reason for this video is, last week was Thanksgiving. A lot of brothers did videos on the origins of Thanksgiving. See, when you talk about so-called Native American history, people talk about the murder, the genocide. It's a lot of aspects of so-called Native American history that get overlooked, that don't get talked about enough. So the so-called Native Americans, they faced a lot of horrors. They was hunted, tortured, killed in mass number, executed. So a lot of murdering was going on. But they also murdered the so-called Native Americans, indigenous people of the Americas in other ways. It wasn't limited to them just physically killing the indigenous Americans. They also killed them by spreading massive amounts of disease and pestilence and viruses, which the reports say, although Esau Edom, the white man, did kill a bunch of so-called Native Americans by the sword, that even more Native Americans actually died by disease, which the disease was given to the so-called Native Americans intentionally to wipe them out. But so the sword being murdered, that was just one of the horrors that they had to deal with. A whole nother horror was the disease and the pestilence. But it don't stop there. A whole nother horror that the so-called Native Americans, really all the indigenous Americas, had to deal with was the extermination of their food supply, which was done in effort to wipe these people out so Esau, Edom, the white man, could take the land. And that's in the scriptures. So again, they had to face the sword, the killing, the murdering, but it didn't stop there. They also had to face the disease and the pestilence. It didn't stop there. They also dealt with a famine, having a food and water supply cut off to eliminate them. Now we're gonna get into this video.
Extermination of over 60 million bison on the
Extermination of over 60 million bison or buffalo.
Great Plains was one of the greatest tragedies in human history. And it wasn't just an environmental disaster. It was a direct blow to the heart of indigenous societies who relied on the bison for their very existence. The tribes of the Great Plains not only faced an immediate loss of a major food source, but a central aspect of their way of life and culture. And the mass extermination of the bison was a gruesome endeavor. Bison hunters and skinners came from all over the United States to kill the bison. Anywhere from 5,000 to 100,000 bison are killed each and every day. This led to starvation, disease, and a breakdown of tribal social structures. By 1890, there were less than 500 bison left on the earth. The extermination of over 60 million bison on the Great Plains was one of the greatest tragedies in human history. And it wasn't just an environmental disaster. It was a direct blow to the heart of indigenous societies who relied on the bison for their very existence.
So you heard that America was once populated with an estimated 60 million buffalo. Going into what? 18th, 19th century, they said it was less than 500. So 60 million all the way down to 500. So Esau Edom, the white man, killed over 59 million buffalo. And that's what we're looking at on the screen right here. But don't worry, we're going to look at it in another video where you can see it in more detail. But again, this is in the scriptures. This is buffalo extermination. It's part of prophecy, what will happen to the Lord's people for being disobedient, which the so-called Native Americans, all the indigenous Americans, North, South, Central America, they're the lost tribes of Israel. But let's go to the second video where we can get it a little more in depth.
Did you know that the once abundant American bison, which roamed the Great Plains in the millions, was nearly hunted to extinction? Not for its meat or fur, but to intentionally starve Native Americans and get them under control? Or that the majestic great elk...
So you heard that. Buffalo drove to extinction to starve out the so-called Native Americans. But now here we go.
The harrowing tale of animal genocide spans centuries and continents, with countless species suffering at the hands of human activity. From the massive destruction of habitat to illegal hunting and poaching, the impact they have had on the natural world. The world has seen many forms of genocide throughout its history, not just against humans, but also against animals. Animal genocides have been a part of human history for as long as people have been exploiting the natural world for their own gain.
They keep saying people being responsible for genocide. No, that's so-called white people. Esau, Edom, the white man, the colonizer, the European, the Spaniard. Nothing went extinct until they came around.
The American bison, also known as the buffalo, was once one of the most numerous mammals on the North American continent, with an estimated population of over 60 million in the early 19th century. These majestic animals roamed the Great Plains in massive herds, playing a crucial role in the ecosystem as primary grazers. However, with the arrival of European settlers, the buffalo faced mass extermination. By the late 1800s, in just a few decades, the population of American bison declined from 60 million to less than 1,000 individuals.
See that? 60 million bison just to 500. So over 49 million bison exterminated, along with hundreds of millions indigenous Americans of North, South, and Central America.
Turn of the 20th century, the species was on the brink of extinction. These animals weren't killed to be eaten. They weren't killed to supply a huge demand. So there were no slaughterhouses and repopulation efforts for animals like cattle, and no trapping or economy for hats and clothing. No, these animals were exterminated in the tens of millions to eradicate their primary predator, the Native American indigenous peoples. Deprived of the primary food source and arguably the keystone species to most Plains Nations tribes, the Native Americans were quickly rounded by and put in concentration camps that still exist today. Of course, today they are called reservations. It was one of the most meticulously planned and intentional evil act by the US government to coerce Native Americans into their control by starving them and becoming more dependent on government support.
See that? No bison, no food, no clothing. That's a conclusion that the white man came to. If they can exterminate the bison, that would exterminate the so-called Native American.
The destruction of the buffalo herds was a devastating blow to the tribes, who relied on the animal for...
And you see that? Let's go back to it. This is an actual picture. Pyramids of bison skulls. So this huge mountain structure that you see would be the bones and skeletons of all the bison that were being exterminated. And for a size comparison, here's a so-called white man standing next to it. So this is literally a graveyard. And this is just one species. How many more species went extinct or damn near extinct? How many people, has Esau the white man killed? So, on his hand, he got graveyards and graveyards and graveyards.
Relied on the animal for food, clothing. The destruction of the buffalo herds was a devastating blow to the tribes, who relied on the animal for food, clothing, and spiritual purposes. The buffalo were more than just a species. They were an integral part of the Native American way of life, and their extermination was a tragedy that had far-reaching consequences. The American buffalo was a keystone species, playing a crucial role in maintaining the balance of the prairie ecosystem. The herds of buffalo helped to shape the landscape, providing food and shelter for other species, and maintaining the health of the soil, as we have talked about in the video where how grazing is helping some countries to reverse desertification and turning deserts green.
So that was the point of the video. So now we're going to get into some scriptures. So this is going to be Deuteronomy chapter 28 verse 15. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of Yahweh thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee. So in Deuteronomy chapter 28, the Lord is speaking to his people Israel, all 12 tribes, that if they don't obey his word, that the Lord would bring curses upon these people. See, first he told them that he would put blessings on them in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 1 through 14. In verses 15 through 68, he gave them the curses. So the blessings for listening, but on the other side of that, the curses for not listening. So the treatment that these people face on this chart that we face today is the result of the curses for being disobedient for so long. But again, the Lord said that He will put curses on us. Now, these curses will play out by other people oppressing us. So, from here, when we go down to verse 49, the Lord is going to give us a clue to who will put these curses on us. The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of earth. And when Esau to Edom, the white man, came to the America, he came from afar. He came from the other end of earth. From Europe to America, he came from afar, as swift as the eagle flieth. Now the eagle is synonymous with Esau Edom, the so-called white man, because what's on the back of the dollar, back on the back of the quarter, what's on different United States emblems, flags, the military, the eagle. And what's the national bird of America? The bald eagle. So again, the Lord shall bring a nation. The Lord shall bring a people against thee from afar, from the end of earth, as swift as the eagle flieth. So Esau, even the white man, he didn't end up in America by chance. Wasn't by coincidence. Now the Lord was sending them to put the curses on his people, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. Because the Native Americans, the Indigenous Americans, couldn't communicate with Esau the white man. And then when you look at the records, Esau the white man came to the Americas with a Hebrew translator. But that's another lesson. Verse 50, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. Because when Esau, even the white man, came over here, and even today, they ain't got no regard for the old and the young. Old and the young get oppressed just like the rest of us. And then going way back, they was killing the young, burning them, feeding them to dogs, smashing their heads against the rocks, cutting them to pieces. So again, a nation of fierce countenance which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. And that will be this people that will be described as an eagle, which describe the white Americans today. Now, as we continue in the curses, we gonna hit verse 18. One second, let's go to verse 18. One second. So all the curses we about to read, which only going to get a few, that would be put on us by the people that the Lord was sent against us. And the Lord described them as an eagle. And it's obvious who portrays themselves as an eagle today. So this is another curse. Curse shall be the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land, the increase of thy king, and the flocks of thy sheep. So the Lord said, our seed, our fruit, the children, the land, the increase of our king, the increase of our flock will be cursed. Meaning what? It will be diminished. So again, curse shall be the fruit of the body. Curse shall be the fruit of thy land. Curse shall be the increase of thy king, and curse shall be the flocks of thy sheep. Now let's look up this word king in Hebrew and see what it means. And you see this is the word king. So king literally means cow, ox, cattle. So, in the sense of the Native Americans, the Indigenous Americans, what was cursed? The buffalo. So cursed shall be the fruit of thy body, the fruit of thy land, the increase of thy king, or the increase of thy cattle. In this case, the increase of the buffalo, and the flocks of thy sheep. In this case, the buffalo. So as we now continue, we're going to go to Deuteronomy 28:31. It's going to speak more about that specific curse. So that's why when we come here, how would the Lord curse the king, the cattle, the buffalo? How would the Lord curse them? This explains it right here. Deuteronomy 28:31. Thine ox. The ox would be the cattle, the king that we just read about, the bison, the buffalo. Thine ox or buffalo or cattle shall be slain before thine eyes. Now we just watched 5-6 minutes of video. And what was the major point in the video? The major slaughter, extermination of the bison here in so-called North America. Read it again. Thine ox shall be slain before thine eyes. So if Esau the white man wasn't busy killing the so-called Native Americans, he was busy killing the bison. So the Native Americans saw their food supply wiped out right before their eyes. And thou shalt not eat thereof. What happened when you don't eat? You starve. What they say in the video. Wiped out the buffalo to starve out the so-called Native Americans. Thine ass, which is a way of saying donkey. But the donkey, the ox, the buffalo, the cattle shall be violently taken away from before thy face. Now, what does it mean to be violently taken away? It's just another way of saying, that the cattle will be slain or killed off. So thine ass, the donkey, the cattle will be violently taken away or will be slaughtered from before thy face, and shall not be restored to thee. Yeah, because when you listen in the video, they said there was no reservations for the buffalo. There was no organization to protect them, to breed them. So when they died off, they were never restored. That's why they were almost drove to extinction. Thy sheep shall be given unto thine enemies, and thou shalt have none to rescue them. And again, this goes for the cattle of the Native Americans, but this also describes what happened to so-called blacks that came to America. Those of us who had land, had animals, had cattle, it was taken from us here in America. So we're going to hit 18 again, then we're going to jump to 31, then we're going to jump down to 51. We're going to read all of this together. Cursed shall be the fruit of thy body, and the fruit of thy land, the increase of thy king. King will be cattle, oxen, or buffalo, and the flocks of thy sheep. Now, when we go down here to 31, thine ox, or cattle, or buffalo, shall be slain before thine eyes, and thou shalt not eat thereof, meaning that they will starve. Thine ass, or cattle, or buffalo, shall be violently taken away from before thy face, and shall not be restored to thee. So their food supply wasn't restored. The buffalo wasn't restored. When the buffalo died in mass number, the Native Americans died in mass number. Thy sheep shall be given unto thy enemies, and thou shalt have none to rescue them. So now, when we come down here, actually we got a little something we gonna read. We're gonna read a little something real quick. Buffalo slaughter left lasting impact of indigenous peoples. So we're going to read this. Bison were not just key to the economies of some indigenous nations, says Emery Maggie Jones. The bison were also important cultural and spiritual symbols. So the bison was more than just a food supply. The indigenous people of the Americas, they lived off of every part of the buffalo, the meat, the fur, the organs, to make oils, medicines. They made clothing, cover. The bones were used to build. They made tools out of the bones, but we're going to get into it. So when they lost the buffalo, they lost more than just food. They lost the things necessary for survival. The mass slaughter of the North American bison by settlers of European descent is a well-known ecological disaster. An estimated 8 million bison roamed the United States in 1870. See, Esau being a devil, he trying to make it not sound so bad. Because he said it was 8 million in 1870. Well, how many buffalo was it in the 1800s, in the 1700s? Two videos already said over 60 million. See that? Esau like to pick certain dates and make that the reference point. Well, what was before that? Like with Black history, he always started at 1492 when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, what was he doing before 1492? That's how these devils try to downplay things. So not an estimated 8 million, but an estimated 60 million bison roamed the Americas before the 1800s. But just 20 years later, which we would say 100 years later, starting from 1800, a fewer than 500 buffalo remain. The mass slaughter provided a brief economic boon to some newly arriving settlers. Esau, Edom, the white men who are Edomites, hunters and traders of the Great Plains who sold the hides and bones for industrial uses. And remember, the Native Americans, so-called Native Americans, lived off the buffalo, every part of it. So these settlers, colonizers, Spaniards, conquistadors, they came and took it from the people. In contrast, indigenous people whose lives depended on the bison suffered a devastating economic shock. So forget the economic shock. The people whose lives depended on the bison, well, guess what? They died. As the bison was being slaughtered and taken away, they died. The researchers quantify both the immediate and long-term economic impacts of the loss of the bison on indigenous peoples whose lives depended on the animal. So we're going to go down a little bit. So here we go. An overlooked economic shock. The economic effects of the bison slaughter are an overlooked piece of the history of indigenous peoples. And that's what I was saying at the beginning of the lesson. When you talk about indigenous peoples' history here in the Americas, people mainly talk about the slaughter, how they were killed left and right, tortured, executed, exterminated by the sword. But what gets overlooked is the plagues, pestilence, and diseases that wiped out even more of those people than the sword. And also how many, many more of these people were wiped out through a famine, through starvation, by having everything took from them. So again, the economic effects of the bison slaughter are an overlooked piece of history of indigenous peoples who are Israelites. For more than 10,000 years, which Esau Don't scratch out that 10,000. Bison served as the primary source of the livelihood for many so-called Native Americans in the region of the Great Plains, the Northwest, and the Rocky Mountains. Along with nutrition, meaning for food, the animals provided hides for clothing, covering, and building, lodging, and blankets, as well as bones for tools and implements. Nearly every part of the animal was used, including the brains to obtain grease for tanning hides and the stomach for creating bags and water containers. So they used every part of the buffalo. Evidence suggests that the bison reliant indigenous societies enjoy living standards comparable to, or in some cases, better than European contemporaries. So the people who survived off these bison, they had a very high standard of living, a higher standard of living, even higher than the Europeans that came over here. So these people lived great lives off the buffalo. A gradual decline of the bison population started with the introduction of the horse and the arrival of the Europeans. You see, they put the introduction of the horse before the Europeans. No, a great decline in the buffalo population started with the arrival of the Europeans. They should have just said it like that, but Esau got to throw smoke in there. By 1870, however, mass slaughter of the animals began, which was before that. Factors that drove the kill-off included the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, improvements in European tanning technology that made bison hides more desirable, and encouragement by the U.S. Army to eliminate the animals to help in efforts to force indigenous peoples onto reservations, which are actually concentration camps. But you see, they put this last to eliminate the animals, to force the indigenous peoples on reservations. That should really be the first thing on the list. That's why they did it. They complaining about the Transcontinental Railroad, pretty much the railroad infrastructure that we got throughout America. They say they needed to kill off the bison to complete the railroads. It's true, but the railroad is not the first, is not the main reason that they decided to kill off the buffalo. It was to eliminate the indigenous people of the Americas, which they had a saying, which they had made an important observation, which I didn't show, but they observed, the white men observed that where there were no buffalo, there were no Native Americans. Wherever the buffalo was, that's where the Native Americans were. That's why they came to the conclusion to kill off the buffalo. And they even had a saying, kill a buffalo a day, drive an Indian away. So they knew the elimination of the buffalo would eliminate the indigenous American peoples. And again, the building of railroads and European technology, that was all secondary to the main reason of them trying to eliminate the Native American people. In some regions, the bison was eliminated in little more than a decade. Described the slaughter as one of the largest and most rapid losses of critical industry in North American history. Centuries of human capital were built around the use of bison. Within 10 to 20 years, their economic underpinning disappeared. Many channels of economic adjustment were cut off for the indigenous populations. Indigenous people were forced onto reservations, which are concentration camps. Their movements were restricted and they were not allowed to become citizens of the U.S. till 1924. So this is more of the history of the indigenous people of the Americas. They died many more ways than by the sword. They also died by the many diseases that the European colonizers, that these Edomites brought to the Americas. Then they also died from starvation, from famine, from having a food supply cut off. So you see here, last point, indigenous people were forced onto reservations. So they wanted to kill the buffalo to eliminate the North American Indian so that they could take the land. Now, also something I got is this right here. So again, they forced indigenous people onto reservations so that the white man could take the land. Now check this out. The Homestead Act. For 300 years, billions of dollars worth of Native American lands were granted to whites alone. Other huge blocks of land were sold to whites for only $1 per acre. Imagine that, $1 per acre. So they stole the land, dished it out to whites only, and then other blocks of land was sold for dirt cheap. Federal programs like the Preemption Act of 1830 and the Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 and many similar state programs were used to confiscate land belonging to the indigenous people to give exclusively to Caucasians. Ultimately, the land mass of the United States came to comprise 2.4 billion acres. The Homestead Act is probably the most rewarding affirmative action program American whites have ever given themselves. Beginning in 1865, 250 million acres of land were given away to white families, many of whom had actually participated in the Southern Confederate Rebellion against America. Well, who cares about that? But so they killed the buffalo. They exterminated the buffalo to starve out the indigenous people of the Americas, so-called Native Americans and Seminole Indians, just so they could take the land and put these people in concentration camps. They took the land, sold it for cheap. So back to a couple more scriptures. So we read Deuteronomy 28:31, thine ox shall be slain before thine eyes, and the buffalo was exterminated right in their face. So when we come down here to verse 51, it reads this. He shall eat the fruit of thy cattle, and the fruit of thy land, until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy king, or flocks of thy sheep, until he have destroyed thee. So this is worded a little funny. He shall eat the fruit of thy cattle. What's the fruit of the cattle? The fruit represent the seed or the offspring of the cattle. So when it says he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle, this don't mean that the white man came through eating up all the buffalo. When it says he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle, it actually means that he will exterminate, that he will kill off the cattle. He would eat, he would kill off the buffalo. Now, let's look at this word eat in Hebrew, then let's see what comes up. Because again, 60 million buffalo, Esau couldn't have ate all them buffalo. So again, when it says he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle, it means to kill off, to exterminate. Now look at this word eat. Eat, devour, burn up. So let's go down and read on this. To eat, devour of beasts and birds, to devour, to consume, meaning by the fire. It says to devour or slay with the sword, to devour, to consume, to destroy. So when it says he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle, meaning that he will slay the fruit of thy cattle. Eat, meaning to devour, to slay with the sword. And with the sword, he what? He ate the fruit of the cattle. He devoured, he slayed the buffalo. And as you continue, the fruit of thy land until thou be destroyed. So the white man, he would devour, he would exterminate the cattle, exterminate the buffalo to destroy the Native Americans, which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy king. And this word king means what? It means cattle, it means oxen, it means cow, it means buffalo. So again, until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee, shall not leave either corn, wine, oil, or the increase of thy king, or the increase of thy buffalo, or the flocks of thy sheep, meaning it decreased until he have destroyed thee. Yep, and the fruit of the cattle and the fruit of the land was destroyed to destroy the Native Americans. That's why it says, until he had destroyed thee. So he was destroying the food supply to get to the people so he could ultimately do what? To take the land. Now, I might can find this real quick. Yep. So let's go back to this Homestead Act when it says billions of dollars worth of Native American lands were granted, meaning stolen and given to whites only. Other huge blocks of land were sold to whites only for $1 per acre. And many programs were used to confiscate, which means to steal land belonging to the indigenous peoples, to give it exclusively to Caucasians. That's in the scriptures. It says what? And they covet fields, meaning take fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage. Now, I want to read this in another translation. Give me about 30 seconds. Let's read this in another translation. Check this out. Let's see how this line up with this Homestead Act. When you want a piece of land, you find a way to seize it, meaning to take it. And how did they take away the land? By killing off the buffalo, which would eliminate the food supply for the Native Americans to starve them to death, to move them on concentration camps that they call reservations. When you, Esau Edom, the white man, want a piece of land, you find a way to seize it. When you want someone's house, you take it by fraud and violence. You cheat a man of his property. See that? They cheated the indigenous people, the Americans, out of their property, out of their land, stealing his family's inheritance. Because the indigenous people had a high standard of living. They was living like a rich man off the buffalo, off the land. And Esau came and stole that. So that's it for this lesson here. Curses of the Indigenous Americans, number 2. This week, the buffalo extermination. And yeah, that was it here. We get a part 3, Lord willing, next time. Shalom.